Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the chairman of DBIA's National Transportation Markets Committee, Jim Avitabile.
Well, good morning, and welcome to the general session for this year's Design, Build, and Transportation Conference. It's been an incredibly busy few days, and we hope you leave here excited about the growing design-build opportunities in your communities across the United States. And hopefully you'll be able to put some of the tools and the practical resources that you've gained in your businesses and interactions here at the conference when you go back to work. When you consider that there's only 8 states in the nation with limited design-build authority, and our own DBIA survey of state DOTs shows an 800% increase in projects last year compared to 2002, it's clear that the future of design-build is limitless. Our goal is to help all of our members, no matter your experience level, to have the tools you need in your design-build toolkit to practice design-build done right. DBIA conferences are not only designed for you, they're designed by you. The comments, the reviews we get for each event help create future conferences and improve upon everything that we do. That's why it's so important that you just take a couple of minutes and tell us what you think. Literally, take out your phones now and use the conference app to let us review this year's event. And we will use those comments and we will read every single one of them, I promise you. We look forward to seeing you in Portland next year for the 2018 Design Build Transportation Conference. So mark your calendars to join us there, March 21st through 23rd. In fact, you can pre-register today by stopping by the DBIA registration desk on your way out. I know that I will. Just like any good design build project, it takes a lot of collaboration to pull together this conference. I want to take a moment to recognize DBIA's Conference Planning Committee and especially this event's co-chairs, Peter Davish and Ben Joba. Peter and Ben, if you could please join me up on the stage. Congratulations. Great job. Come on over here, we got a day to do it. Next, I'd like to call my panelists for how ports are using P3 effectively up to the stage. Gentlemen, if you'd join us. What we're trying to do is try to emphasize that design build isn't just roads and bridges. There are other modes of transportation that help constitute our national transportation network. And ports and waterways are a very, very vital part of that. So here today with me, we have Dennis Lambert from COWI, North America. Dennis is the chair of the COPRI P3 committee from ASCE and extremely knowledgeable professional in the area of ports and waterways. Kevin Karloff from the Port of Vancouver. We were able to convince Kevin to come down and participate in this conference, and you're going to have the opportunity to hear from Kevin about one of the most exciting P3 projects that is ongoing right now with Kevin's organization. And Stephen Steckler of IMG Rebel. Stephen has a great amount of experience in the finance aspects of all P3s, but I was able to identify a presentation that Stephen made to AAPA, and after seeing that presentation, I knew he was the right person to draft for this particular panel on this topic. So I'm really excited about these individuals and what they have to share with us today. Okay, so what we're going to talk to you about briefly is why ports are very important, and P3s in particular are a timely and relevant topic. We're going to talk a little bit about the industry and how there are some challenges that we need to overcome in the United States. We'll get a little bit of a case study, if you would, from Kevin with regards to the Port of Vancouver. And we're going to talk a little bit about where P3 port projects make sense and how they make sense, and what the industry can and should be doing to make them a little bit more easy, if you would, to implement. So let's talk a little bit about our U.S. Marine network. It involves or consists of both our inland ports and waterways, which are maintained and operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it also includes our deep water ports, all of them shown on this map. About 50% of those deep water ports are publicly owned and operate, and about 50% are privately owned through some type of a land operation and maintenance type agreement. Deep water ports are natural candidates for P3s, and I'll explain to you why. And I think you're also going to get from this presentation that inland ports and waterways could be as well with some minor adjustments. So if we look at why these are really a good opportunistic situation at ports for P3s, let's look at our world-class marine system and how it evolved. It didn't evolve with public money entirely on its own. If you look at this little circular graph here on the lower left-hand side, you're going to see that since 2012 to 2016, the public expenditures in our ports infrastructure was roughly $16.2 billion. But our private sector investment on ports and marine was $21.4 billion. So you can already see that there's a certain amount of public-private investment occurring. It's just a matter how you harness that through procurement. Now, if you also look at the big map and you look at all the dots on there, those are just the private-owned and operated terminal facilities owned by one company, Kinder Morgan. So all these slides will be made available to anybody that wants to get a little bit more detail later on, but you can see that there's a lot of private investment. So now we look at our ports and infrastructure. Right now we're really thinking in terms of what happens with the post-Panamax vessels and getting ready for that influx of increased capacity. Yet with all the talk that's happened over the past several years and with the Panama Canal already open and operating, there's still only 5 U.S. deepwater ports that are post-Panamax ready. And 4 of those 5 are on the West Coast. The capacity constraints are not just depth, it's channel depth, but it's also berth space, terminal storage, rail connections, and air draft. So in other words, we have some areas where there's just bridges that are too low that are constraining capacity. And when we look at our inland waterways, we have 12,000 miles of inland waterways, 196 locks, 200 chambers, and most of them have exceeded, if not all, their useful lives. So what that means is right now we're in a fix as fields approach. What does that mean to us? What that means is that in 2010, there were $33 billion in costs associated with these facilities not operating properly and economic impacts to businesses because of those delays. And by 2019, that number is projected to be $49 billion lost. When we think about post-Panamax situation, we think about the size of the ships. So I thought this graphic was really nice to show you. But what I really want you to think in terms of is not the capacity of the ship, but how the capacity of the ship impacts the facilities. They're basically twice the size, and they're not stopping. These ships are growing. Why? Because the owners and operators have to in order to increase their profit margins. So if they can move twice the capacity with the same basic costs for fuel, more efficient use of fuel because of the newer ships, and also the fact that the labor costs are going to be halved because of fewer, if you would, people having to deal with a per TEU unit cost. You can see how this drives the demand and the need for these vessels. So when we look at the vessels, and these will give you an idea how big they are huge, okay? And the post-Panamax vessels are already starting in operation, and there's about another 1,300 or so that are already on order. These are charts. All of this information, by the way, was taken from testimony to Congress. So I'm not necessarily creating any of this information. This is information that's out there, and I try to take the best source so that you could have what I'll call the best information available. So it's not merely just a matter of the size of the ships. The size of the ships are going to be driving the need for our capacity at terminals to accept the volume, and our ability to move it through both rail and other connecting facilities. But what's really driving this is the development of third world nations, and those economies becoming more established. So when you look at the demands, and most individuals in here that work for public agencies and Department of Transportation understand this. This is something that we've been looking at and planning for a long time because we're concerned with the increase in truck traffic on our interstate systems. So when you look at this demand, it also affects the ports, which is exactly where the point of entry for all of this is. What it is going to show you is that there is going to be a huge increase with respect to where the volume of TEUs, these are those container units that are shipped, basically one truck container, from 2011 volumes of 20 million TEUs per year to 50 to 60 million. That's a huge increase, and we just don't have the capacity at our facilities to handle this. So the question is going to be, how will our market respond? We have several significant issues. The aging of our marine infrastructure. It's estimated that we need $15 billion investment just to get it break even. The projected increase in the vessel sizes are going to put additional stress and demands on our existing facilities. The existing terminals are going to need new equipment, they're going to need more space demands, and they're going to have to be able to move and store these equipment, these TEUs, at a capacity that they've never seen before. And yet there's also limited private capital from the terminal operators. Now, why is that? Plain and simple, most of the terminal operators have diversified, and they are the ones that are paying for these brand new, expanded post-Panamax vessels. They've tapped into most of their capital, and they just don't have more money to continue to invest in our ports. It's got to come from somewhere. And as I mentioned, this is really all driven by our global economy. So with that, I'm going to ask Dennis to come up and talk about the status, if you would, of the industry.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
So my name's Dennis Lambert. I'm with COWI North America. I'm in the Marine unit, and I always tell this story when I give a talk, and it's really pretty simple. I am on the Waterways Committee of ASCE. It's within the Coast, Ocean, Ports, and Rivers Institute. And I just simply asked a question in November on our call of 2014 about what is ASCE's position on P3 for the Corps of Engineers? And there was a lot of chatter in the room, and it resulted in me being named the chair. That was my qualification. So I had a friend that I went to Tulane with in New Orleans, and she sits on the Mississippi River Commission. So she's now the president of ASCE. Many of you might know her. Norma Jean Mattei is her name. And I asked her to be our vice chair. So that's how we got started. We have over 50 members today. This is just a little introduction about COPRI as the acronym. It was created in 2000. Our subcommittee was created in 2014. So we have our first meeting in early 2015. We immediately reached out to the Corps of Engineers, which we knew was working on alternative finance as early as 2012. And we had a meeting in St. Louis, which is one of the inland ports. That is actually the point in which anything south of that, there are really no locks and dams. They're locks, but they're not part of that system, the inland waterway system that has locks and dams on them. But anyway, they shared with us their vision for alternative finance, and we defined 3 goals at that meeting. One is to educate, the other is to advocate, and the avocation and facilitation are part of what I'm doing here today. We've also had 3 workshops. The first one down in New Orleans, which is where I live, and we held it at the New Orleans district. And what we did is we invited all the stakeholders and the non-federal sponsors to come into the room and understand what the Corps is proposing, because the Corps has impediments in actually procuring a P3 contract directly. They have come up with this novel idea of calling it a P4, but it basically is a delegation of the contracting authority to the non-federal sponsor. So we went over that in our first workshop, and it was it was a closed workshop. We invited a little over 100 people, and about 85 people showed up. And we had a second workshop in New York and a third one up in St. Paul. And next week we'll have our fourth in the Bay Area in California. So the state of our infrastructure globally is in trouble, not just in our country. And there are several organizations that publish these statistics on the need for investment in our infrastructure. This really underpins what the Corps, I would say their justification for trying to do alternative finance. When we're looking at the different flavors of procurement starting at design, bid, build, which is the traditional, really prior to Katrina down in New Orleans, that's what the Corps did. It was very prescriptive. And then they started to look at other alternative project delivery, like early contractor involvement, design, build, et cetera, and now P3. They've also introduced what they call the divestiture program, where they actually are trying to transfer the ownership of an asset to a non-federal sponsor or even a private entity. This is their P4 model. Again, it's basically a delegation of the P3 contract to the non-federal sponsor. And then below that, you have your traditional players. So this is really the key slide to understand what the Corps of Engineers is facing. I know down in New Orleans and in Louisiana across the coast, we have several ports that just aren't getting their channels maintained. The priority is the Mississippi River, and we've had a deepening on our books since 1986. Word of 1986 was when it was authorized to go from 45 feet to 55 feet. If we would have done it, we'd be ready for the Panama traffic. But they simply are not being funded for the mission that they have been given. These are the statistics. And just think of it as an inventory of your own. If you had a business, $268 billion in assets. That means that they own and operate and manage these assets across our country, and that's all the locks, coastal harbors, some hydroelectric dams, et cetera. On those assets, they have a $140 billion O&M backlog. And that's mind-boggling to me. The way that Eddie Belk, who was the chief of operations at headquarters, used to describe it, was that it's like buying a $30,000 car and having about $2.48 to operate and maintain that car. It just does not work. And they get $5 billion a year to manage, operate, and build new projects, which they have a $60 billion new project backlog. So they really, the locks and dams are an easy one to look at because ASCE has continuously graded them a D or a D minus. I don't think they've gotten an F yet, but as they always say, that's not a good grade to take home to mom and dad. I think that there would be a lot of trouble. What the problem is that most of those locks were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So they're not only are they old, I think half of them are more than 50 years old, and half of that half are more than 80 years old. And if you're in the marine business, you know that barge fleets today are quite different than they were in 1940. They're 3 or 4 times larger. So these fleets have to break down every time they go through a lock, up and down the Upper Miss and the Illinois and the Ohio rivers. So the Corps, in 2012, as mentioned, they began to explore alternative finance. They had to go to all their stakeholders and their non-federal sponsors. And then in 2014, Congress passed a authorization for them to start a pilot program. And so one of the things they wanted to look at immediately was the inland waterway system. This is a very similar slide on tonnage that Jim had. And again, you can see that the Mississippi River is a main artery in the middle of the country for the movement of goods. And this was the 20, I didn't have a time to upgrade this. This was, I think they're a D minus 2017. This was the previous report card. And these are the delays on the locks since 2000. Normally, the locks just become inoperable. They just cannot maintain them. So what the Corps has done in response to the WRDA 2014, and just remember the acronym WRDA traditionally is Water Resources Development Act. And in 2014, many in Congress are quite mindful of the problem, and they decided to use the acronym Water Resource Reform Development Act. And part of that was the authorization of P3. And they're looking at the Illinois waterway. There are 8 locks on that system. If any of them are out, the system's out. And the LaGrange lock is in the worst shape. They've estimated, I've seen different estimates that range from 600 to just shy of $900 million in O&M backlog on that one waterway. One of the problems with it is that the maritime barge fleet industry does not want to pay a toll or a lockage fee to upgrade that system. Their argument is they already pay a toll through the gas tax, which goes into the Inland Waterway Trust Fund. And it's funny, they call it a trust fund, and you think in terms of your own savings account maybe, or if you are a descendant of somebody that has some wealth, that there's an account that's in your names you might get one day. But that's not really what this trust fund is. That money goes into the general fund. It really is not right the way the system's set up, but they came up with the tax because they wanted to have an even revenue across the whole system and make it fair to all the stakeholders. But what the Corps has to do is then compete for that money that's in the general fund, again, through the OMB process, which is a scoring process. So you have several impediments. You have, or challenges, I would say. One is you have a stakeholder that is against any kind of new fees or lockage, tolls, anything like that. You have a revenue source that goes into a larger fund that you then have to compete for, so it's not ring-fenced. And in Illinois, they don't really have a special purpose vehicle for the P3 contract. So they're still working on that project. The other project that is underway is the Fargo-Moorhead Diversion Project, and they do have a special purpose vehicle for that. It's called the Fargo-Moorhead Diversion Authority. And what they have done, this was roughly a $1.8 billion flood protection project where they were planning to divert the Red River of the North, which separates the state of Minnesota and North Dakota, and it splits the city of Fargo and the city of Moorhead. And they're going to divert this river into a channel through various water control structures for about 35 miles and then reconnect it to the Red River. And what they have decided to do on this project is break off about $1 billion worth of work and procure it under the special purpose vehicle, which is the P4 version. They call it a split delivery there. That complicates the contract, but because part of the contract is dependent on the federal portion. So here's the layout of the project, and the green is the delineation of the channel, which would be done by the non-federal sponsor, and the purple shading is the federal portion, which is basically a very large earthen embankment that will dam up the floodwaters, and then it'll be released based on triggers into the channel. So I did pretty good. I had 3 minutes and 28 seconds left, Jim. We were worried that Q&A might be cut short. So there's a couple things I want to pitch. One is, if you want to join our subcommittee, we've been working very closely with the Corps. We went to a roundtable that General Semonite put on last fall, and right before the election. And as y'all know, it is a priority of this administration to change how we do business. And P3 is one of them. And the president did appoint DJ Gribben, who worked at HDR and Macquarie, as his advisor. And they are working on the infrastructure bill. And I believe we will begin to see, some draft of it within the next 45 days. But if you want to join our subcommittee, we have already transmitted a findings report to the administration, and Harvard Business School has done the same thing. We basically are echoing the same message, and it's the federal impediments, which one is the federal government basically cannot take a concession, and it cannot do an availability payment. I can get into the details of that in the Q&A or after, but and ring fencing, and there are various other issues. We will have a workshop. If your colleagues are in the Bay Area, please let me know, and we can get them into the workshop. There's my email address, and anybody's welcome to come chat with me afterwards. That's all I have for today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming and giving me an opportunity to speak. My name is Kevin Karoloff, and I'm here representing the Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority, perhaps better known as the Port of Vancouver. We're located in Vancouver, BC, on Canada's west coast. Our mandate is to facilitate trade, protect the environment, as well as work with local communities. Our long-term vision is to be the world's most sustainable port. It's something that we take very seriously, and we're working towards as part of all of our key projects. We are North America's third largest port by tonnage. We do connect Asia and South Pacific markets to Canada, as well as into the Midwestern U.S. and the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. And indeed, we then connect Canadian manufacturing as well as US manufacturing back into the Asian South Pacific markets. So as you may expect, as a result of that, we significantly matter to the Canadian economy. We represent about 100,000 jobs. We bring in about 20 billion in gross economic output, about almost 10 billion in annual GDP. And what's exciting for us is that we're growing. As you heard in the previous speakers, Canada's not immune from that. We're looking at 4% year-on-year growth, and we predict by 2035 that our throughput on Canada's west coast for containers will double from what it is today. And it's very important to us that we take advantage of that growth, because that growth itself, between direct and indirect, will represent $2 billion per year in GDP. So to meet this growth, we're doing a variety of things, but the big step change project that we are embarked upon is Roberts Bank Terminal 2. So if you look on your screen there, what you see in the center, that exists today. That's two operating terminals, a coal terminal there you can see at the front, and there's a major container terminal behind it. Off to the left, that's actually just water today. There's nothing there at all. You could take your sailboat and sail right through the middle there. But that's what we aim to build. So when it's complete, T2 will be able to handle 2.4 million TEUs per year. It'll be a semi-automated facility. We'll be building approximately 100 hectares of new land, and it'll have a total capex of approximately $3 billion. To deliver the project, we're looking at a two-part delivery model. Now, part one will be a DBFM P3, and that will be looking at delivering everything from top of rail down. So that'll include the buildings, the pavements, the rail yards, the wharf structure, etc. And then part two will be a long-term operating lease, which will then provide everything from top of rail up. So that will provide all the ship-to-shore cranes, your RMGs, automatic stacking cranes, all your mobile equipment, labor. They'll be responsible for all revenue, making lease payments, etc. So if we were to represent that graphically, this is basically what it looks like. You can see the financier, design builder, and a maintainer will come together and they'll form DBFM Project Co. They will enter into a P3 arrangement with the Port Authority. Separately, the Port Authority will then enter into the long-term operating lease with a terminal operator. So why did we choose a P3 model? Well, for us, the key thing that we really liked about the P3 was the ability to transfer risk to the party best able to manage them. And we also saw a tremendous benefit in being able to access the benefits from having a whole-of-life view in the costing. We were definitely concerned about companies coming in and short building on the upfront capex and then just resulting in longer-term OpEx operations. So the risks that we transferred, we had some big ones, to say the least. The first one was around schedule. In West Coast of Canada, as I expect many of you deal with, we have very strict environmental regulations that we must deal with. As a result, we have fisheries restrictions 9 months of the year. So you can imagine the construction scheduling challenges that this creates when 3/4 of your year you're dealing with either a salmon window closure or a crab closure window. And so we really wanted to be able to transfer those risks to the private sector. The other big risks we have are technical, and this list I could go on for my whole time, but I'll just talk about a few. So our wharf structure is 30 meters high. That's equivalent to a 10-story building that's going to run 1.3 kilometers long. Now, to install that, this will likely be done with caissons, which in the marine industry is not necessarily never been done before, but in this part of the world, we have 21 foot of tidal variation that can draw a 6 to 7 knot current. So it will keep even a very experienced marine contractor on their toes. In addition to that, the seismic requirements in this area call for vibra replacement down to minus 47 meters. Now, to my knowledge, that's never been done anywhere in the world before in a marine environment. If anyone knows different, I'd be happy to hear about it after. But these are some of the risks that we're looking to transfer to the private sector. And then the risks don't just stop during the D&C. They continue well into the O&M period. Being a semi-automated terminal, the tolerances for differential settlement, for example, are very, very tight. We're measured in millimeters over hundreds of meters. So it's very important that we are able to have one party that designs and constructs the facility such that it can meet the long-term O&M requirements. The other challenge is this is a 24/7 day-a-week operation. You can't just go in there 8 hours at night and just tune things up. It basically has to be a maintenance-free facility. So that was one of the key things that kept us up at night, and we felt a P3 would really help us transfer those risks across. So to do this effectively, it's really important that the specifications are done in a quantitative way. I think the easiest way is to look at it as an example. The focus of a P3 is to do an outputs-based specification. So if I look at something like the ship-to-shore crane rails, I'm not, for example, going to specify they have a certain number of piles or type of piles under the crane rail. What we will specify, though, is that you have a tolerance. So it might be 10 millimeters of differential settlement over 100 meters. If they hit it, they get paid. If they don't hit it, they don't get paid. That's basically the way a P3 works. And once a payment is lost, it's gone forever. So what that means for us, it's not that the contractor or the DBFM project co gets it right eventually. They have to get it right every single month to make sure they get paid. So it's a very strong, it's a very powerful risk transfer mechanism. And this runs for 30 years, or the life of the contract, which for us will be approximately that. And so in order to allow industry to price and manage this appropriately, it's very important that you put forward all of the information they need to do their job, which means a well-populated data room. So just working with the same example, there's a lot of geotechnical risks on this project, and we've invested approximately $10 million in geotechnical investigations to ensure that all of the parties have the information they need to price, develop, design, and construct this project effectively. We've done vein shear testing, for example, down to 180 meters, which again is something which is very unique. We had to get special equipment created just to do that type of work, basic testing, advanced lab testing, etc. So when they come in during the bidding period, they'll have all the information they need. But there's some risks that we don't transfer. First one is environmental permitting. It's just too much of a wild card. We're in that process at the moment. To transfer that risk to the private sector would be very, very difficult. It's very costly, and the time, it's just not controlled by us. It couldn't be controlled by the contractor either. It's really controlled by for us in Canada, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. And so that's a risk that we retain ourselves. The second risk that we retain ourselves is community and stakeholder negotiations. It's very sensitive. It's one of our mandates, so we do try to look after that. Another key aspect of this is dealing with utilities. And in that situation, a lot of utilities typically have very prescriptive requirements for connection agreements and that type of thing, and that's fine. We will enter into connection agreements, and we will effectively have carve-outs within the P3 that some of the aspects of it will be effectively a bid build almost in nature. And then the financial backing, and I'd just like to talk a bit more about the financial side of things. So P3s are attractive to lenders in particular because they provide a low-risk annuity stream. Typically, the projects may have a user pay aspect to them, but often the debt providers in particular are shielded from this. And what happens, so you typically have a creditworthy entity who backs the debt obligation. And this is very critical to keep lending rates comparable to the public sector, or else the credit risk is too high. You'll end up with too much equity in the deal. If you want to maintain high debt to equity ratios, it's important that you have an investment grade transaction. And overall, you still want to be making sure you get value for money. There is a cost for transferring risk, but you don't want to make sure you're not overpaying for that transfer. So let's look here at an example if the port wasn't involved. A lot of people said, well, why don't you just let the private sector deal with it? So if we did that, the terminal operator would need a return, a commercial rate of return on a much bigger capital outlay. In addition to that, DBFM Project Co. now is dealing with a higher credit risk, so they're going to deal with higher rates of return. And as a result, the deal is no longer cash flow positive. There's just not enough cash in the deal to make this work for all the parties. But if we insert ourselves into the middle, and we're using the full financial strength of the Port Authority, so not only the cash flows from this particular deal, but we're willing to put all of our cash flows to back the deal, we can alter things enough that we can make it cash flow positive. So I suppose just to talk about that a little bit more, so now the terminal operator is only investing in above rail assets, so they need to see a commercial return on a smaller outlay. We have a different risk profile, so we can get a smaller rate of return, which would be acceptable to us on the landmass. And then the Project Co. has a higher credit entity backing the deal, so they can take a lower rate of return on their lending. So it is anticipated that the lease payments from the terminal operator will cover 100% of the availability payments to DBFM Co. But if it doesn't, then the Port Authority will use its wider revenue stream to cover DBFM Co.'s availability payments. And this creates an investment-grade transaction. So that brings us back to this slide, which I showed earlier. So here's why we have the two-part deal. By separating Project Co. from the volume risk of the terminal operator, we create a deal that gives us low lending rates, which makes the deal affordable on the P3 side of things. And then by separating the terminal operator from the massive land base investment, it becomes more economical for them. So a few people may be asking, why is the Port Authority getting in the middle of this? Isn't this just public funds backing private sector enterprise? Well, no. As you may recall from my earlier slide, we have this growth that's happening. It's our mandate to facilitate growth. And if we don't enable industry to meet this growth demand, then Canada will lose out on this $2 billion a year in economic GDP. So when you're in a case where the economic benefits far exceed the specifics of the project, my view is that it's certainly appropriate to enter into these types of arrangements and work with industry to benefit the economy and benefit everybody. So keep in mind that it is a partnership. I think this is a key point to keep in mind. While we'll be investing $2 billion, the terminal operator will be investing $1 billion. So everybody has substantial skin in this game. No one's going to just walk away. And while it may appear that the deal's a little lopsided, it's important to realize that the risk profile of the terminal operator is much, much higher than it is for the Port Authority. You can't underestimate the challenges associated with keeping that terminal full, keeping the operating rates low so that the deal is cash flow positive, maintaining all of the mobile equipment has much higher maintenance obligations, certainly than civil infrastructure. So it is a quid pro quo arrangement. So in summary, the Port Authority chose a P3 model really for its ability to transfer risk. It allowed us to meet our mandates to facilitate economic growth and development within Canada. By using the P3 model, we also, having user fees, allowed the project to be effectively self-funding. And the private sector will get involved because they are going to be able to see reasonable rates of return for their risk and economic spend profiles. So, thank you very much.
Morning. You know, I don't drink coffee. And so, in fact, I hate coffee. I hate mocha ice cream. So when I had to wake up this morning, I reached for my Diet Cokes that I had stowed in my hotel refrigerator. And I started to pound one down, and then I stopped for a second, and I remembered what happened to me about 25 years ago. This is back before infrastructure was cool. So they couldn't find anybody to interview. And when they wanted to learn about infrastructure financing and innovative delivery techniques. And so CNN was doing a special on infrastructure, way ahead of its time. And our crumbling infrastructure, it had the same ASCE grades. Got it, I'd hate to have been graded by the ASCE, or by the, I think it was the ASCE when I was in school. So anyway, as I started to reach for the soda this morning, I thought, no. I remember the lessons that I had 25 years ago whenever CNN called and wanted to do an interview. When the day of the interview came, I'd been prepped ahead of time. I was a consultant at Price Waterhouse at the time, and it was very unusual for a young person to be interviewed on something like that in Price Waterhouse, and so they freaked out. And so they sent down a media specialist who told me a bunch of things that I couldn't remember. And they told me three important things, though. One, when you're being interviewed, sit on your jacket. Why? Because it keeps the jacket from crumbling up behind your neck. Second, don't wear a loose shirt. Why? Because you look like a white-collar criminal being interviewed on TV. And third, not to drink soda before an interview or before a speech. And I said, why is that? And they said, because you'll burp all the way through the interview. So CNN, being CNN, was late coming up from Atlanta. In fact, they were about 3 hours late. And I was nervous about the whole thing anyway. And so finally my mouth was dry, and finally I got desperate, and I broke through, and I pounded down a couple of Diet Dr. Peppers in rapid succession. And just then the whole crew shows up from CNN. So this is an interview that was supposed to take about an hour. It took about 3 hours because I kept burping during the interview, and they had to cut it and redo it. And when they ran the special on our crumbling infrastructure later on, I was certain, I really didn't want to watch it. I was absolutely certain that in the middle of that interview, there was going to be this giant belch somewhere in the soundtrack. But it didn't happen, and so I lived another day. But today we're going to talk about, if when the slides come up, new capital for your port infrastructure. Now, IMG was founded about 23 years ago, and we were doing all kinds of surface transportation infrastructure. We did P3s before P3s were cool. And Rebel Group is a Dutch company. We're a Dutch-American company, and they're headquartered in Rotterdam. We were headquartered in Washington, D.C. They have offices all over Europe. We have offices in Washington, D.C. And we swapped some shares and some staff and became a Dutch-American company. But one of the things that they brought with them a few years ago, which has been important to the company's growth, is expertise in ports, being in Rotterdam, headquartered in Rotterdam. You can understand that. And specifically port P3s. Now, Rebel's a consulting company, but they also an investment company, and they had invested in a number of small P3s, including the locks and dams of the type that we were talking about earlier. And they are, and we have become fairly advanced in our thinking on P3s, specifically for port facilities. And some of the lessons on highway and other transportation P3s can come through on ports, but some are very specific to ports, because unlike highways have patrons and users, but ports have tenants. And yes, both things have throughput, but it all lives and breathes around the tenants. We work both sides of the table. We represent investors, and fairly often, and including some of the largest infrastructure investors in North America. And so today's discussion is going to be mostly about what it is that you should be looking to get and the investor perspective on public-private partnerships in ports. What you should be looking to get is new capital, of course, unlocking the potential in the port. Design, build, and operate efficiencies. Of course, risk sharing. From the investor side, of course, you're looking for a reliable rate of return. You're looking for stability and predictability in both your partner and also in your cash flows. You're looking at certainty of construction and operating costs. Most P3s are done via, in fact, almost all P3s, regardless of what sector they're in, and we work across different sectors, incorporate design build. An investor typically tries to bracket their risk as much as they can onto other parties, including the designer and the constructor, including firm fixed price. They prefer a lower risk. The worst thing that can happen in a P3 to an investor is a late kill. We'll make that the second worst. Excuse me. There's a project going over budget or a project that doesn't deliver the returns, of course, is the worst case, but a late kill. This is after you've gone through the entire process, you've competed with other bidders, you finally win the darn thing, you're working through the permitting processes and all the other approvals that have to get done. At the last minute, some joker on the public sector, no offense, changes his mind and says, nah. It happens. It happens a lot, actually. And that's one of the things that the folks we work with take pretty seriously when they get into a P3 arrangement is this real? Is this something that's actually going to go through? There are opportunities to add value, and that's what the investor looks for. Some of the projects that you think look like an attractive investment are actually may not be attractive to an investor because they really do want to add value because they want to extract part of that value or all of it. But they want to be able to do something with the assets. So the notion of it's fine to design and build it, but it's a lot more fun and a lot more lucrative to be able to operate and maintain it for a long enough period of time where you have beneficial control of the asset. Other investor considerations is the project currently in the Port Master Plan? If it's not, then we're not quite sure how dedicated you are to the project. Is it a competitive situation? This is both regionally and within the port. Are there other facilities that are competing with what you're building? I mean, competition's okay, especially if you're doing a cargo container facility, you're going to have competition. And you're going to be competing with other ports in the region. You may be competing with other tenants in the same port if the port's large enough. You expect that, but it is a consideration. You want to know your market position. Is there local opposition to the project? Try doing a port project, for example, in Portland, Oregon, the Port of Portland. I hope no one here is from Portland. But if you are, you know what I'm talking about. Have you discussed it with the Army Corps? We want to know that the Army Corps stands behind the project. We don't really want the Army Corps involved that much because if you think procurement is difficult with a third party like a port authority, and it's usually not that difficult, it's really difficult once the Army Corps is involved. So if you're doing a P3, even if the Army Corps is going to be the operator of the facility that's being developed, you really would prefer to deal with the port as the private side of the deal. So we're perfectly happy to see the 4P model. Where P3s like to play is in certain types of facilities. The sweet spot for P3s is in the yellow circled area on the chart, and that includes the quay walls and the channels and locks and landfill development. In other words, if you're taking spoils and you're developing new land that's stable enough to be able to build something on for the long haul, and it's well located, that's actually fairly attractive to the private partner. And if it's not attractive as an individual project, if you're doing a dredging project, it's attractive as the icing on the cake. Some great opportunities for port P3s include core port facilities. We like core port facilities. We're a little worried whenever you're being asked to take full market risk. I know the folks on the toll road side are used to taking full market risk, but trust me, you don't want to, and neither do the investors in highway projects. They like them because they're highway projects, and the people who provide money to them are used to highway projects, but they don't like that market risk. Likewise, core port facilities are great because they don't have the same kind of market risk that more merchant facilities do. Terminal support assets make excellent P3s. These are the facilities that support the port's activities for the tenants. They are not necessarily core infrastructure. Quay walls and apron areas, again, they are part of core infrastructure. They can be done as a public-private partnership. They can have dedicated revenue sources, or they can be done as an availability payment. They're usually an excellent credit. They're not going to go away. We like those too. Rail branches and loops, although you basically have to take your life in your own hands when you're negotiating with freight railroads. A dedicated rail loop, especially if it's a common use rail loop on port land, is a great opportunity for public-private partnerships, in part because you've got a captive audience, as long as you've got a diversified tenant mix that's able to make use of that rail loop. If you've only got one car importer, for example, using a rail loop, or you've only got one merchant container facility, you get a little worried about what kind of credit there is for that kind of rail loop. Service and access roads, looks a lot like toll roads, although they're not. Utilities and pipelines, transit sheds, access roads and bridges. We like all of those things because it's a captive audience it's the only way you can get in and out of the port, and we love monopolies. Storage and tank farm facilities, when you can develop them. In Texas, you can develop them. It's more challenging to try to develop them in California or in Oregon or even in Washington State, which says it likes ports, but we're not sure we trust them. And also for navigation. In fact, navigation facilities are a very interesting area, and it's one of the things that we're working on. We're working on a barge-to-container facility. We are working on several large deepening and widening projects. The deepening and widening projects are not complicated, but they are quite interesting to our investors. And they do because they tend to be solid credits, even when those credits are based on individual tenants. This is the case of an oil terminal in France that we were involved with. And typically the Port Authority provides the berthing, the area, the landfill, and the jetty, but the French P3 approach actually has, in this particular case, for this large carbon fuel export facility, those types of activities are being done by the private developer operator under a public-private partnership. So again, this is core port infrastructure blended with tenant improvements. And it's an interesting combination because it combines two different credits. One is the credit of the port, two is the credit of the tenant, and there's actually a third level of risk in it, which is a modest amount, actually should say a large amount of market risk. But because you've got all three parties involved in the credit, it's much more attractive to investors. And so we were actually able to do the financing with a relatively low cost of capital. Of course, in France, they don't have federally subsidized municipal debt like that we do here in the US. But this is an example structure similar to the one that's been shown earlier of transferring risk to a private partner through an innovative structure. A word about navigation P3s, and that's important. It's one of the things that has actually aroused a lot of interest on both the public and private side. I can't say that we've proved the model in the U.S. There really is an issue with the Army Corps of Engineers. My brother-in-law is actually deputy commander, and he rolls his eyes whenever he talks about the difficulties of channeling a public-private partnership directly through the Army Corps of Engineers. There are a couple of projects we're working on in that regard. One of them is a $600 million channel deepening and widening, a 25-mile channel. At the end of that, one end of the channel is the Gulf of Mexico. At the other end of the channel is two very, very large, multi-billion-dollar factories. And they have to bring in a lot of raw materials, and right now those materials the ships bringing those materials have to be broken up offshore into smaller ships capable of navigating the channel. We calculated the benefit to the shippers, to those two tenants specifically and their shippers, bringing in these raw materials into the port of what it would save them if they could bring in larger ships to be able to take advantage of this deepening and widening. Now, the alternative here to doing this as a P3 is essentially waiting how many years, decades perhaps, for the Army Corps of Engineers to come around with an appropriation to pay for this. $600 million is a lot of money. There are a lot of competing projects. But for these tenants, it would be worth it. And so we did an estimate of the savings that these tenants would have, and showed them that in fact it would be useful as a useful for them to be the credit in a public-private partnership. I'm going to skip over this and wrap this up. But this is one of the locks that Rebel is an investor in Europe, where we're operating under an availability payment, incentive payment structure. So if you want to have private capital and you want it bad, as badly as the image here, be sensitive to the points in the process where you try to bring a public-private partner in. Ideally, the private partner would like to come in earlier during the planning process. They'd like to be part of the port's master plan. That way, at least to know about the project and to have it bid somewhere just after the master plan is completed. They need this provides the investors with a clear path to a partnership and a clear process. And that process, the lack of a public-private partnership process for most ports, almost all ports in the U.S., is probably right now the number one hindrance to a public-private partnership. The Trump administration is talking a good game about public-private partnerships, but it has to go through Congress, which is reluctant to fund really very much anything in the infrastructure space beyond what's already there. Our hope is that the new funds coming in, however small or large they are, will incentivize as many port authorities as possible to create these investment structures, to create a P3 process, so that every time we knock on a door, they're not saying, "Can you explain this whole P3 stuff to us? And can you explain the process we would have to go through?" If that process were already in place, and the regulations were already in place, and the protocols were not a mystery, and would fit within the existing laws governing that port authority, that type of process certainty would greatly reduce the threat of a late kill. And that is exactly what we are looking for in port P3s. So with that, I'll conclude and hope that the next time we have a session like this, that at least a few ports out there have advanced their processes the way Vancouver has, and have joined us in the search for good public-private partnerships. Thank you.
Okay, if you can hear me, I think our mics are all on. The good news is we have about 15 or so minutes available for question and answers from the audience. I hope you've enjoyed hearing from these experts. and you have an opportunity to ask them specifics. It would help a little bit if maybe you want to direct a specific question either to Dennis, Kevin, or Steve. And if it's a general question, let us know. Also, after we use up to 15 minutes, these panelists have agreed to stay after the session and interact with anybody and engage you in discussions afterwards. We'll do that right off the stage. So with that, anybody have a question that they'd like to ask this group? We get a microphone to Stephen. Thank you.
Steve DeWitt with ACS Infrastructure, P3 Developers. A question about ports and real estate. We're seeing people trying to connect real estate development with the financing end somehow of port development. And as you know, they're very different types of assets, and infrastructure developers like us may not necessarily be real estate developers. Could you speak a little bit about why that might make sense, why it may not make sense, and how the market can sort of adjust to whatever the owners are looking for there? And that could be to any of you, really.
Sure. You're absolutely correct. In fact, we've gone to investors with several projects, not just in ports, but in airports and in surface transportation, where there was real estate mixed with a commercial opportunity, with an infrastructure opportunity, and they just really have difficulty getting past that. Those funds that are out there have been raised, and those funds have been raised from specific segments. A few years ago, we tried to start a fund ourselves and ran into the fact that the portfolio managers for these large funds are segregated into real estate, natural resources, and maybe something that looks like infrastructure. They don't really talk to each other. I think what you have to do is to almost push real estate to the background in those circumstances and make the infrastructure and actually do some work at making the infrastructure the bigger part of the credit. And they can get comfortable with that, which seems really strange because real estate, especially when it's on a public authority's land, is actually a relatively low-risk proposition, but it's not the same investors. So that's what we've done when we try to shape the public-private partnerships is really look to the infrastructure and the provider of the infrastructure as the credit and not the real estate, not the underlying real estate play.
Can I follow up on that, Steve? I'm going to ask you, again, we don't have a lot of port authority represented today, but if there are port authorities that have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get you up here as quickly as we can. One of the big problems is that there's a big sea change in how the toll facilities are operating, and the inland ports have a little different challenge. They've always operated on their own as opposed to using a P3 model, which actually could help solve their problem. But on the port facilities, the port authorities generally have their own real estate group, and of course that group thinks it's very successful if it executes a lease. What we need to do is we need to get the port authorities to recognize that there's opportunities for them using procurement methods such as P3, but they have to break that mold, and that also means that those real estate groups need to recognize that their opportunity to make a deal is actually the revenue stream that could end up helping to generate the model basis for advancing a project, or at least enhance it. Am I correct?
Yeah, I would say we've actually had a lot of success when we go into a port in dealing with the real estate people on the port. It may simply be the ports that we're talking with, but they're eager to do something with to do things with their land, and they'd like to do something that's core to the port's activities as opposed to having it become parkland or something like that. So that's not the experience that we've had out there, but I'm sure there are folks who aren't experienced who just aren't that comfortable with development, period, who see themselves as preservers of port land as opposed to developers.
And that's not to say that you're looking to change the way that the ports operate entirely. They need to maintain their operations the way they are, but you have to enhance it by looking at what are the infrastructure needs of that port authority, or how can you enhance the effectiveness of its operation. So with that, another question? Any port authority representatives that want to come out and agree, disagree with anything that we've said today? be more than happy to entertain that dialogue. No, right down here in the front, Richard.
I'm actually here for the next conference, the water conference, but there is very much of a link in infrastructure between water, transportation, and the rest of them. Do any of you want to comment on what can be learned between transportation and water as it relates to infrastructure?
Maybe that's you.
Sure. The WRDA is an excellent example of where, through some weird misunderstanding or not really caring, they combine water and wastewater P3 projects with the Army Corps of Engineers type navigation projects. And then EPA, the Army Corps wasn't capable of administering that program, so they gave it to EPA. So EPA actually has people who are dealing with maritime P3s alongside the same people who are dealing with water and wastewater P3s, potentially, this is with the WRDA funds. So Congress is, when they scored the budget to see what kind of leverage they could get out from the loan program, from the TIFIA type loan program that's been set up for water, which is WIFIA, they used the risk profile for the water and wastewater sewage facilities to score it. So TIFIA has, but know what TIFIA's core funds are now, but it can leverage about 15 to 1, 10 to 15 to 1. But because they used the water and wastewater as the benchmark, they actually, the scoring scores at about 40 to 50 to 1 leverage, because water and wastewater facilities have extremely low default rates and they're system financed. So we'll see what happens whenever the first maritime project comes up in EPA under WRDA and WIFIA as to how that's scored. But so far, $70 billion can create $4 billion worth of projects. So that's good news. And so whether that gets used in water, wastewater, whether it gets used for navigation projects, that's a lot of money.
Well, thank you all for attending this morning. I'd like to thank our panelists, and like I said, we'll be standing over by the stage if anybody wants to engage them in discussions. Thank you all very much for participating. Appreciate it.